Hey students. Okay, so this is the Irish history lecture I promised you. Normally we'd be doing this in class, we'd be stopping a lot, I'd be asking you questions, you could ask me questions, but this is a recorded video, so I'm just gonna kind of go through it as quickly as I can. And hopefully if you have questions, please ask me in Slack. Okay, ready? We're gonna start 8,000 years ago. In 8,000 BC, actually a little more than 8,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, 8,000 BC, hunter-gatherers arrived in Ireland from Europe. So that's kind of like the start of people there. And then we're going to jump forward a lot to the mid-5th century AD. St. Patrick and other Christian missionaries arrive, and they begin to subsume the indigenous Celtic religion, a process completed by year 600. So I'm guessing many of you have heard of St. Patrick. There's a great legend about St. Patrick and the snakes. He was actually captured from Britain by Irish raiders and taken as a slave to Ireland. He lived there for 6 years before escaping and returning to his family. He came to be revered as a patron saint of Ireland. He's credited with banishing snakes from the island, which is kind of funny because all evidence suggests that post-glacial Ireland never had snakes. One suggestion is that snakes actually referred to the serpent symbolism of the Druids of that time and place. And now that I'm thinking about this, I usually recommend a song. Oh, and I'm going to blank on it. I'll try and remember to send it to you in the Slack about the Druids, which I think you will find funny. So, all right, going on. A couple hundred years later, 800 AD, more than a century of Viking invasions wrought havoc upon the monastic culture and the island's various regional dynasties, yet they survived and assimilated the invaders. So I don't need you to memorize the dates here. I'm going to be sending this to you as notes, so you'll have all the dates if you need them. Mostly I want you to get a sense of, here's Ireland, this land that was sort of under attack over and over and over again for 700 years, as you're going to see. So for 100 years, it was the Vikings, but the Irish mostly managed to sort of survive the Viking invasion, in part because the Vikings, basically they came, they were like, we want the gold. The churches have the gold, we're gonna come and take your gold candelabra, etc., so on. And then they would go off again because they were raiders, they weren't looking to colonize, right? They came, they looted, they raped some women, they left again. Some of them stayed, so and they fell in love with a local girl and they had kids and they became part of Irish culture. So there are some Vikings, sort of, if you trace down the family lines. Okay, so now we jump forward again. We get a very specific date, 1169. That was the coming of the Cambro-Norman mercenaries under Richard de Clare. He was the second Earl of Pembroke, nicknamed Strongbow, so that when you see him referred to in histories, that's who they're usually going to be calling him. There's actually a hard cider called Strongbow, which is quite tasty. That marked the beginning, 1169 and the coming of Strongbow, marked the beginning of more than 700 years of direct Norman and later English involvement in Ireland. So if you don't know what Norman is, Norman are the people who gave their name to Normandy, a region in northern France. They were descended from Viking conquerors of the territory and the native population, which was mostly Frankish and Gallo-Roman stock. And I actually have a song recommendation for that as well. There's a song in the musical Once Upon a Mattress called Normandy. Normandy is fine and fair, Normandy is where I'll be. So there's going to be a fair bit of music in the next 2 weeks because it's pretty key to Irish culture, as you'll see as we keep going. Okay, so now we're going to jump forward to another political period, 1534 to 1691. It was the English Reformation. So this was a huge political shift in England. Questions about the loyalty of the Irish vassals. A vassal is sort of people who owe fealty to another group. If you think way back to what we read at the start of the semester, to the Benedict Anderson, where he was talking about one of the elements of these modern nation states was that they were autonomous, they ruled themselves. So the Irish at this point weren't ruling themselves, they were being ruled by the British, they were vassals. Okay, so there were questions in England about the loyalty of them, and that provided the initial impetus for a series of military campaigns. Before, it used to be that England sort of had control, the Irish landlords would pay them some taxes, but were kind of left to run things on their own otherwise. And now the English crown began asserting full control of the Ireland. The English Reformation is a pretty big deal. You may have covered it in some of your other history classes, but just as a recap, it's a series of events in 16th century England by which the Church of England first broke away from the authority of the Pope and the Roman Catholic Church, and it's associated with the wider process of the European Protestant Reformation. In England, it was largely driven by changes in government policy, and then public opinion gradually kind of came around and accommodated itself. And it was based initially on Henry VIII's desire for an annulment of his marriage. So if you're not familiar with Henry VIII and all the stuff about his marriage, his wives, etc., that's a great story. And there's all kinds of like movies you can watch on Netflix about it. So he wanted to annul his marriage. The Catholic Church wouldn't allow it. And the English Reformation was really more of a political than a theological dispute at the beginning, although in the end, we end up with Protestants and Catholics as a division, which has great consequences across the world. This period was also marked by an English policy of plantation. So plantation is not like plantations in the South. This policy of plantation is, I would say, similar to what happens in Israel with the settlers that are sent to Gaza. It led to the arrival of thousands of English and Scottish Protestant settlers in Ireland. And it's a very effective means of colonization because, if you send soldiers in, then people can fight back against the soldiers. If you send families with little kids in and say, this is your land, here's your house, it becomes much harder to get rid of them. You've got mom out there like working in the garden and the kids running around her, and you don't really want to just kill her to take the land back. So it gets very tricky. Okay, so that's plantation. So a little bit further, early 17th century, and we're gonna start moving faster because things are happening fast at this point. The military and political defeat of Gaelic Ireland became more clear. By then, the role of religion as a new division in Ireland became more pronounced. So religion had not been a real source of division up until then, and there was a lot of people sort of coexisting with different religions. Now sectarian conflict becomes a recurrent theme in Irish history. And that's a really important word, sectarian. So that's bigotry, discrimination, or hatred arising from attaching importance to perceived differences between subdivisions within a group, like different sects, which is where you get sectarian, such as between different denominations of religion or factions of a political movement. So then we're going to go forward a little bit more. 1613, the overthrow of the Catholic majority in Irish Parliament led to creation of numerous new boroughs, all of which were Protestant dominated. So this is called gerrymandering. So we contend with it in America today, where the politicians redraw the borderlines to give their party more political weight. And there's a great graphic I will try and remember to show you that shows how gerrymandering works. It's very effective as a way of holding on to political power. It's not very effective at ensuring people are actually represented by people who believe what they believe, et cetera, so on. Okay, so now the Protestants are coming into power, and very effectively, now there are enough of them by the end of the 17th century, all Catholics, who are now 85% of the Irish population is Catholic, right? But all Catholics were banned from the Irish Parliament by the end of the 17th century. Political power rested entirely in the hands of an Anglo-settler colonial, and more specifically, the state Church of England minority. while the Catholics and some Protestant denominations suffered severe political and economic privations. This is the era where, when they say privations, it is very harsh. People were building what were called bolt holes in their houses, which were hiding places for the Catholic priests, because they might be killed if the soldiers came across one. People were holding secret church masses, which were forbidden. The justification for this, for doing things like banning all Catholics from Irish Parliament, you listen to that and you're like, how could they do that? It's 85% of the population. This is where I would say, look at those cartoons in the Cheng article I gave you. Look at the way they depict the Irish people and the Catholics, as they show them as brutish, as ape-like. They connect them to Black people who they also were seeing as less than human. They describe the Catholics as dirty. They talk about how much they breed, which is, and again, like animals, Catholics weren't allowed to use birth control, and that became another sort of division between the Catholics and the Protestants, this sort of rhetoric around, oh, they have so many children, they're going to overrun us like, like rats, right? And you actually see a lot of that same kind of rhetoric and dialogue when people talk about women who are not married, have kids in America, and live on welfare. The sort of phrase welfare queens is exactly the same sort of setup for saying these people don't deserve help, they don't deserve to have a voice in government, etc. So, and again, like any time in any kind of politics, this is absolutely still relevant in America right now as we ramp up to the next election. Anytime you see some group of people being portrayed as less than human, that's when you should be really suspicious, right? If they're being compared to animals, be suspicious of that, right? This is the kind of critical thinking that we hope you're going to be learning here. Okay, so things hit maybe their worst point. Hard to say what the worst point is. In 1801, the Irish Parliament was completely abolished. They stopped pretending that Ireland had a government. Ireland became part of the new United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland under the Act of Union, which is a nice name for something that took away somebody's government. Catholics were still banned from Parliament at this point, 1801. Now there was resistance, and eventually in 1829, they did manage to push back enough to get Catholics the vote again. So Catholic emancipation was 1829. However, the only way they did that was they had to say you had to be essentially a wealthy landowner in order to vote. This is similar to, in America, the poll tax. If you can remove the poor people from the vote, then they're not going to vote for things like, increasing the minimum wage or universal health care, et cetera. So they gave the Catholics back the vote, but only the wealthy Catholics, essentially. So, and then there was a lot of fighting for a long time and a lot of resistance, both in political circles and actual fighting. From the 1880s on, the Irish Parliamentary Party strove to attain home rule, self-government. And home rule, you may remember that phrase from Passage to India. That was also what India was fighting for, was home rule. In 1914, they actually did win. Ireland won the Home Rule Act. That's a couple decades before India. India doesn't actually gain independence until 1947. But it doesn't last. Home rule in Ireland was suspended on the outbreak of World War I, which was also 1914. World War I, 1914 to 1918. If you memorize no other dates while you're in college, if you can memorize the two world wars, that will make me happy. Okay, then, so they still don't have the vote. 1922, there's, and now we're really jumping through a whole bunch of stuff. We have the Irish War of Independence, the Anglo-Irish Treaty. In 1922, the larger part of Ireland seceded from the UK to become the independent Irish Free State. And this is a division that still exists today, right? After 1948, that became the Republic of Ireland. The 6 northeastern counties, known as Northern Ireland, remained within the UK. And then that led to the Irish Civil War. And the history of Northern Ireland has since been dominated by a sporadic sectarian conflict between mainly Catholic nationalists and mainly Protestant Unionists. This conflict erupted into the Troubles in the late 1960s, where you have bombings, etc. And that lasted for 30 years until finally there was an uneasy peace. So that is a super fast overview of Irish colonial history. I hope it helps ground you as we go forward through the readings in this course. Again, if you have any questions, let me know on the Slack, and we'll talk more soon. Bye.